Hello and welcome once again to Connected, a podcast brought to you by Nova Economics Club. Here we try our best to connect important figures from our society with you at home. Today we have the chance to talk with a member of the European Parliament, Lidia Pereira. She took her bachelorate in economics at her home city's university, Coimbra. Later, Lídia did her master's in European Economic Studies at College of Europe. Her first job was at the European Investment Bank in Luxembourg. She then worked in consultancy firms like UI and Deloitte. She decided to raise the bar further and embark on an European journey. In 2018, she became the leader of the Youth Europeans People's Party, the youth wing of the centre-right European Party EPP. And in 2019, at only 27, she was one of the elected members of PSD to represent Portugal in Brussels, or Strasbourg, you know the drill. Lídia was enjoying the sunny and not at all rainy weather in Brussels so much that not only did she get re-elected to the European Parliament, but also became Vice President of the EPP. She is now the longest serving member of the Portuguese delegation. Welcome to Connected, Lídia.
Hello, very good to be here.
Thank you. We'll start by talking about your job at the European Parliament. What is the thing that you are most proud of having accomplished since you work at the European Parliament?
Well, that's a very interesting question because I think one of the main things that I can be proud of is actually being elected in such a young age. I was 27 when I went to the European Parliament in 2019. And I think that does not only serve as a personal recognition, but a recognition for the younger generations. And then the good work being recognized as well. Like I have been attending several COPs. Last week I was in Baku at COP 29, and
you led the European Parliament delegation.
And for the first time, after all the COPs that I have attended, I was the head of delegation on behalf of the European Parliament, and so I think it sends a very positive message for younger generations. That it is possible to shape our future through being a decision maker. But there are other moments that I can recall that give me a sense of accomplishment. For example, the fight against tax fraud and shell companies. I was one of the leaders of this regulation, the Unshell regulation, or even the contribution to create a true digital payment system in Europe, like kind of what we have in Portugal, which is called MBWay, but making it a European-wide system, or even like I mentioned the climate change conference, but being involved in the climate change legislation. That the environment has been on the top of the European priorities, and back in 2020, the president of the European Commission, back then, she presented the European Green Deal, and then in 2021, at the peak of the pandemic, we approved the European Climate Law, which is the first climate law in the world, which basically states that we will have to be climate neutral by 2050. And everything that has unfolded after this moment, which was the Fit for 55 package. So basically the roadmap for decarbonizing our economy and at the same time making sure that we have economic growth. So I was involved in all these negotiations on very important files. And I think it is a great opportunity to work with moderate forces that are committed to the European project. So these are just a few examples, but obviously being elected as a vice president of the EPP group in the European Parliament and being 33, it's also a recognition that what I have been doing, it is good, it is making an impact that matters, and so it serves as an example for all other younger politicians that want to shape policies and the future, to send a message like be there, fight for your ideas, and there is a way that we can actually work together for a better future. This might sound as a bit of a cliche, but I really believe in that, and I really believe that all I have done so far, it is producing an impact.
Yeah, talking about a great future and staying on the topic of the green transition, what do you think that the EU is doing right, and what is it doing wrong with its green transition?
Well, so let's go back to the context. 5 years ago, there was a European Parliament composed by a certain majority that was more left-leaning, but that did not undermine or compromise the leadership of other political forces more on the center-right, and I'm referring in particular to the EPP, to deliver an agenda that was necessary in terms of climate change and environment. But this context sometimes steered the discussions on the climate legislation or an environmental legislation that went a bit too far in elements as bureaucracy and administrative burden. And so now that we are implementing, because a lot of things have been approved, but only now that are becoming that are being enforced. So there is a sense of urgency to fine tune some of the elements that were approved and that bring a lot of difficulties for companies, for businesses, and mostly for SMEs, which are the backbone of the European economy. So what I'm trying to say is this: the level of ambition was rightly set. The instruments to achieve such ambition are still, there is some margin or some room for improvement, not to jeopardize our competitiveness. And given that we are talking about this, you know that there is a very famous report that was recently published, the Draghi report, and I feel like every day I always refer to the Draghi report. But just one remark on this: a lot that is already that is in the Draghi report, I have been throughout the past 5 years referring to in the several negotiations that I had. So it's not particularly new. The diagnosis was there. The strategy or the recipe to resolve it, it's actually interesting, because Mario Draghi sets a short-term, medium, and long-term vision to accomplish the challenges we have ahead of us. So that is particularly new. The diagnosis is not. But the Draghi report states that we have a huge opportunity with decarbonization and fostering economic growth through, for example, another dear topic to me, clean tech. Clean technologies can shape the way we have access to clean energy and cheap energy, which is so important for SMEs. So I think these are, if I can sum up, these are the elements that we have to focus on for the next 5 years, is to have be very, determined on the objective for having competitiveness in Europe, knowing that we have a very challenging geopolitical context. We have a war in Europe, not a war inside the European Union, but a war in Europe, and I'm referring to Ukraine. We have a war in the Middle East. We have a lot of small regional conflicts that are worldwide that very rapidly become international conflicts. So we have a bit of a turmoil in terms of politics, in terms of polarization. This is a much more complex world than the one that our ancestors knew back 100 years ago. We have climate change. It's becoming very evident. If we look at the fires in Portugal, which were happening at the same time that there were floods in Eastern Europe, more recently Valencia and Malaga, south of Spain, heavily affected by the catastrophe that we have witnessed. So we have a much more complex world, but we also have to, bring or deliver hope for the younger generations, and that goes with, making sure that we remain competitive, that we remain on the top of innovation, that we bridge the innovation gap, which is another element that Draghi mentions in his report. And so it is I anticipate not being an easy political cycle, but one that is possible to deliver. But we can only achieve that with moderate forces. And there's, because of the polarization, and I see that in the parliament, a very fragmented parliament. But I also think it is time for the moderate parties to not to lose track on what brought us in the European Parliament in the first place, and that is people. It is delivering for people's expectations.
And do you feel like the current composition of the European Parliament is committed to the green transition?
I don't see any signs that we should lower the ambition and the green transition. Draghi stated it very clearly. It is an opportunity. What I see is some reluctant forces that want to revisit what we have stated as a priority. So I think to be honest, I don't see one political force questioning climate change. I don't see climate deniers in the parliament. Maybe some, but those we know who we are talking about. The challenge I see is to combine both competitiveness, climate change, green transition, and also defense. So these are 4 points that I think are going to be necessary to have a lot of dialogue between the moderate forces in the European Parliament.
Okay, so you mentioned the Draghi report, and in that report he suggests that the EU faces substantial red tape compared to other regions, namely the United States and China. Do you think that this level of regulation is affecting the EU's ability to innovate?
On some stances, yes, it is, and that's why the President of the European Commission announced this week, which was the election of the College of Commissioners. One of her first remarks in her speech was to develop a competitiveness compass. So basically, which has 4 different dimensions or indicators to make sure that any other European legislation does not undermine the European competitiveness. So this is a real action, one of the first actions of the new Commission that I think says a lot. It's very self-explanatory for the years to come.
Yeah, there's that saying that the US creates, China copies, and the EU regulates. The US is still creating, China has started creating. Is the EU stuck on regulation, or is it time for us to also start creating and innovating? What are the steps to take in order to increase innovation in Europe?
Well, that's not entirely true. There's a lot of creation in Europe. There's a lot of innovation happening in Europe. What is happening is that we are losing talent for other regions of the world, the US or even China. There's a lot of researchers, there's a lot of entrepreneurs that find easier in the US immediately to invest. And so one of the difficulties we have is that we don't have a functioning capital markets union, which makes an obstacle when you are an entrepreneur and you want to fundraise capital to invest on the next phase of your company or of your project, of your startup. So that is the difficulty that I see as a priority for the next 2 years and a half, Because if we don't move further with the Capital Markets Union in the next 2 years and a half, I think we can conclude that it will be 5 years again that we have been discussing the same. I hear about the capital market lagging behind. I listen about Capital Markets Union since I was studying in the faculty. So that was some time ago, not a long time ago, because I can still say that I am a little bit younger than my other colleagues, but it has been the case, and nothing has moved. And not because of the parliament. And let me say this, it's mostly because of the national governments that see the Capital Markets Union as something that can take away part of their sovereignty, yes, but also their economic capacity in a way. So this is absolutely in the hands, mostly in the national governments, and that's why when I have meetings with organizations in general, with companies, and they all come to me and say, we have to move with the Capital Markets Union, and now the European Commissioner in charge of that is a Portuguese lady. She used to be Minister of Finance. She knows the drill. How can we assure that we move forward? And I tell to all these people, it's not in the hands of the parliament. The parliament has been very vocal about the need to move forward with that. It is in the council. It is where the prime ministers sit that they have to find the political will to overcome the obstacles that have been somehow hindering the capacity for advancing, making progress on the Capital Markets Union. And let me say this, it's not only because of a feeling or closing the innovation gap. There's another dimension for the Capital Markets Union in particular, is that we have a very aging society in Europe. We have a European social model. We have a European social market, but our European social model, based on social security schemes, how can we assure that we have sustainability for the time when we will retire, that we have action to our pension? So I think we need to shift to a different approach. And I believe that the Capital Markets Union can also answer to this challenge.
Well, maybe with the new president of the European Council, he'll help with that.
Well, to be seen. But I hope I have hope in him that he can, move on that.
Okay. AI is probably going to be the most important technology of the next decade. But it also brings heavy energy and water demands.
Yeah.
For example, a prompt in ChatGPT requires about 25 times more energy than a regular search engine. Does the EU have a planned strategy to meet these demands? Is it a concern?
It is a concern. Water is a concern. Water scarcity. Coming from Portugal, I'm particularly sensitive to that. Portugal and Spain are, by all studies published by the IPCC, for example, the intergovernmental panel on climate change, the Iberian Peninsula will be one of the most affected regions in Europe by climate change, with heavy impacts on water scarcity. So AI, it is an opportunity. We have to combine it with climate change. And so let me tell you something interesting. We've been talking a lot about AI, but there's another one step ahead of AI, which is already quantum computing. And there are projects that connect quantum computing and climate change to deliver on the need that we have to connect the dots, like, for example, in developing predictive systems that can alert when we have a catastrophe happening, and that we can better prepare the communities for that. That is adaptation, but it comes from climate change. But what I'm trying to say is this: the innovation and scientific knowledge can be at the service of climate change. And this is where we, as Europeans, we have the knowledge, we have the know-how, but we still lack on, scaling up the technologies to address it. So I see an opportunity, and there are very positive signs from the new European Commission. One of the commissioners I have been working more is the Dutch representative, Wopke Hoekstra. He's also former Minister of Finance, which is interesting because he knows on the way the importance of financing and the environment, how we bridge these two difficult matters. But I do see the momentum for scaling up AI, clean technologies, innovation in Europe.
But with this kind of energy demands, do you think that to move away from fossil fuels, that nuclear could play a role? Like Google and Microsoft have already started to implement small nuclear reactors. Should we do the same?
Look, I'm not an advocate for nuclear energy, but I don't have a closed opinion about the development of innovation on nuclear energy. So what I can say is that Portugal, for example, we are a great hub for clean tech, for solar, for wind power. Should we invest on nuclear energy? I have my doubts, but if there is developments, scientific developments on nuclear energy that make sure it is more secure, that it is actually a clean energy, but if there is assurance that the nuclear waste is better treated and this does not represent a threat for the environment, look, I'm open to that. If it is what we need for more rapidly decarbonize our economy, I can be supportive of that. What the data tells us is that at the moment, one of the things that constitutes an obstacle for cheap and clean energy in Europe is because we don't have a functioning grid. And countries as Portugal and Spain that can be hubs of solar, wind power are not connected to the rest of Europe. But we do need energy independence and clean energy. So if nuclear can be, if these new elements of nuclear can be of help for that, I am obviously supportive of that. But what I know at the moment is that there are alternative ways of securing cheap and clean energy that are not being used because of national interests. I give you an example. France has constantly been blocking energy interconnectors through the Pyrenees, which would enable Portugal and Spain to export clean energy to the rest of Europe. The reason is simple, because France has nuclear power stations, and obviously they want to sell their own energy for the rest of Europe. But then it compromises the capacity for scaling up of alternative technologies that can even be cheaper and that can be deployed faster. Because a nuclear power plant takes some time due to the process of certification, the environmental impacts, and so on. This is the scenario, but as I say, I don't have a closed mind.
And the Iberian Peninsula has great conditions. We have the three: wind, solar, and water energy. So
yes,
why aren't we investing more?
And even waves, the energy coming from the oceans,
water,
and
both lands and waves. Yeah. So staying on the climate. The UN has released a report stating that no progress was made in 2023 to keep the world temperature increased to a maximum of 1.5 degrees. Do you feel that other countries are putting in as much effort as the EU so that there is in fact progress and the world achieves the Paris Agreement goal of decreasing emissions by 43% until 2030?
I think there is some progress, but it is not the necessary progress. that we would need to, we have to say that. Countries as the US, countries as China, which have huge responsibilities at the moment for greenhouse gas emissions, countries as India. But at the same time, there is some progress, not the one that we would need to keep the Paris Agreement alive. Now, what we are talking about is no longer 1.5 degrees, but 2 degrees. And that is already serious, because we see the impacts of climate change very concretely. They are very visible. So what I'm saying is, no, there are regions of the world that are not doing enough. And I can attest that that Europe is actually the leader. Having been in Baku in COP29, in the several meetings that I had with countries that are most vulnerable, because we are referring to African countries, to small island states. They all look at Europe as a reference and a beacon of hope for climate change, because they were asking us several times, please do not lower the ambition, because the moment you step down on the ambition, other regions will have the excuse for not doing more. So one of the things that we were calling in this forum, in this COP29, the European Parliament, was to revisit the list of contributions, the classification for countries to finance or to be more ambitious on climate financing, particular China. We are referring to a list. So I don't know if it is relevant for the discussion, but I'm just going to mention the climate financing comes from or is applied for different reasons. One is climate change, the other one is adaptation to climate change, and the other is loss and damage. The last topic is more relevant for the vulnerable countries, because they are, in terms of the level of GDP, they have a much lower GDP, but they need more money, not only for loss and damage, but as well for the adaptation. So these are the three elements when we refer to climate financing. Now, who is financing? Who are the donors? Who is contributing? You have a difference between the mandatory contributions and the voluntary contributions. And in the Paris Agreement, it was defined in Article 9.1 and 9.2, the elements, the criteria for mandatory and for voluntary contributions. And so countries as China are seen or are defined in the voluntary contributions, because they are still considered a developing economy, a developing country, and for that reason they don't have to contribute on a mandatory fashion, which I think does not make sense, because when it was defined, the classification for developing and developed countries, this dates back to 1992. I was 1 year old, and the world has changed. Like 30 years have passed, and countries as China are no longer, or should not be considered as a developing economy, and they should step up the game in climate financing. But as well, India. So one of the things relevant from COP29, for example, was that, okay, the European Parliament wanted to increase the donor base. It was not possible to revisit the articles that define the mandatory and voluntary contributions, but countries as China understood, by the pressure of countries led by, for example, Uganda, which is the president that holds the presidency of the G77, so which usually can be referred as the most vulnerable countries in the world. By the pressure of these regions of the world, but as well by Europe, China is willing to put more money through the voluntary contributions. This is positive, but it is not sufficient, because still we have, as European Union, the objective to be climate neutral by 2050. China has the objective of being climate neutral by 2060. And these 10 years can make a huge difference, because what we should do, and this is quite harsh on the developed world, is now in the medium term, whereas China has much more time, but they are also much more responsible for CO2 and greenhouse gases emissions.
Yeah, you focused on China, but I have a question about the US. As we all know, Trump, the elected president, has left the Paris Agreement in his first term, and he has promised to leave the Paris Agreement again as soon as he steps into office. Does that change the EU's approach to green transition?
No, it does not change. The path is very clear. Decarbonization, economic growth, cheap energy, clean energy. So it doesn't change. What changes is that also the role of the US in the geopolitical world. It is true that Trump in 2016 he withdrew from the Paris Agreement, but a lot of states of the United States did not. So they kept the level of ambition the same, and the US also decreased the level of emissions in the past years, not as significant as the European Union, but still they did. And there's one interesting thing, which is, or two. One is to see that oil and gas states in the United States are heavily investing in clean technology, for example, Texas. And another thing is that, well, we know that Trump is a bit of climate denier, but there is one element, or there's one person in his inner circle that is not, and I'm referring to Elon Musk. He's a very controversial figure, but he has two main concerns. One is the AI, and the other one is climate change. I don't know to what extent the heavy investments in clean technologies cannot take away the European leadership on this front, because you know that the US functions in a very different way in terms of dealing with environment, and so I think there is a risk that we lose, we as Europeans, we lose the European leadership to the US, because they see a potential for a business model that can be much more interesting for the US at the moment. So, and just to conclude, you know that it was very famous, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. Do you know that they could not mention environment on this title, because then the Americans wouldn't be on board. But the IRA is a plan for decarbonization and addressing climate change and promoting economic growth. So what I'm trying to say is this: if the Americans see that there is a business model behind, they will be on board. So maybe we cannot say climate change, but they will be on board. They were on board with the heavy tax breaks that IRA entailed. So to conclude is this: I think there is hope that through economy, through potential business models, that we can still work together in this transatlantic relationship and delivering on climate change.
Okay, so the last question, and please, if you can answer it shortly. There is growing instability in the East and in the West, as we all know, and Europe is almost totally reliant on the US and Eastern Asia in terms of semiconductor production. The European Chips Act entails a 43 billion euro policy-driven investment. Do you think it's enough? What should the EU do in this front further?
We need to scale up investment, public investment, but the main objective, I think, is to keep technology and the innovation in Europe and not losing it for other regions of the world. So I think we are very aware of the. Just to recall quickly, during the COVID crisis, during the pandemic, it was obvious that we were in the hands of countries as China for medical equipment, for medicines. So I'm not saying that we have to move into a more protectionist fashion, because I'm not on board with that. We need to keep fostering international trade. International trade can be the driver for the regions of the world to be on board with the responsibility for addressing climate change, for example. But when it comes to technology, we need to, massively boost Europe as a hub for innovation, and obviously as well for the challenges we have in terms of defense. And that's the reason why, for the first time, we have a European Commission with a commissioner on defense. So if you ask me if the numbers are sufficient, I'm going to tell you probably not. But if we have money available, it also has to go to the economy. And a lot of times that money is available, but does not reach the companies and the organizations that have and the academia even that can have the capacity to scale up that.
And is the goal for Europe to further integrate itself into the supply chain or become self-sufficient?
Well, that's to be seen. I think it's also dependent on the development of the context of war that we have. But as I told you, I'm not on board with this mindset of protect. That is, in the end of the day, protectionism. Which is the same that the US is trying to bring again with the Trump administration, which was not different from Biden. This is important to say. Because if we don't have international trade, then I think our capacity to keep developing decreases. Which does not mean that we should not look inside and try to scale up what we have best.
Okay, great. So just to end this conversation, we'll have some quick-fire questions. The idea is for you to answer them. It's like this or that in a couple of seconds. You don't have to explain your reasoning behind. If you want to, you're welcome to. So, Brussels or Strasbourg?
Strasbourg.
Okay, Keynes or Hayek?
Hayek.
Charles Michel or Antonio Costa?
Oh God, you're gonna make me say that? No, Costa.
Okay. Being an economist or being a politician?
Being a politician.
Winning a Nobel or becoming president of the European Commission?
Well, given my first, the previous answer, I would say president of the European Commission.
Yeah, and last question. Carlos Marx or Carlos Guimarães Pinto?
Well, that's an easy one. Carlos Guimarães Pinto.
Okay, that's all. Thank you for coming, Lydia.
Thank you very much for inviting.